convinced that because I was very visible that day, and very vocal and very active, that the National Guard shot at me intentionally. I think they also shot at perhaps half of the victims on purpose. I think the other half were just random victims of the 67 bullets that were raining down on the parking lot. Some of you might be familiar with this photograph right here. Michener, I think, referred to this guy as the brazen young man with the black flag. Well, that brazen young man was me. Fortunately, when they were down on their knees there, and that is Troop G, these were the killers ultimately. You can see that about a dozen of them are down there. They're aiming their guns toward us in the parking lot. And this was about 5 minutes before they marched up the hill and turned and fired back down into the crowd. If they had fired here, I wouldn't have had a tree to get behind, and I think they would have definitely killed me there. But as it turned out, when they marched up the hill, I was able to be in the area by the tree, so the tree saved my life. Because there was an order to fire, out of the 72 men, only about a dozen from Troop G stopped, turned, and fired 67 bullets during 12.53 seconds. We always say 13 seconds to round it off. 67 bullets during those 13 seconds into the crowd. In 1975, that there was a verbal command, fire. There was an order to fire at the top of the hill at the time of the shootings. This is something that Michener does not talk about either. As a person who was a participant in that demonstration in downtown Kent, what happened, and I know why it happened. And James Michener doesn't really refer to the invasion of Cambodia too much as a highly motivating factor. But in fact, if it wasn't for the invasion of Cambodia on the night before, April 30th, you wouldn't have had a demonstration in downtown Kent at all that evening. That was the overwhelming motivation among the students that were there that night. Also, the chosen few motorcycle gang played little or no role whatsoever. They may have rode their motorcycles up and down in the streets, but it was anti-war activist students that were clapping their hands and chanting anti-war slogans even before they moved out into the street. I know who the first person was that threw the first beer glass at the first police car that came through that night, which precipitated the whole event that evening. I know who that was. And I've talked to him and I've interviewed him for my own research and for the book that I'm writing. It was not an outside agitator. It was a full-time Kent State student that did this. It was a student that was very upset and concerned about the expansion of the war from Vietnam into Cambodia. This was the primary motivating factor, and James Michener doesn't, I don't think he gives enough credit to that very provocative action by President Nixon at that time, expanding the war from Vietnam into another country. However, I admit, and I always admit this, there were some people in the crowd, maybe they were the drunks of the crowd or the anarchists of the crowd, I don't know who they were. Some people broke out windows also in buildings like a hardware store, a drugstore, etc. And there was a small amount of looting that went on, a minimal amount of looting. For the most part, you had anti-war slogans spray painted, you had the banks hit and these other businesses, a total of $5,000 in damage. Now, people were upset. After years of praying and hoping that the war would stop in Vietnam, when Nixon expanded the war into another country, this set off protests not just in Kent State but across the country. In fact, concerning the ROTC fire the next night, we have documentation of over 30 ROTC buildings that were attacked and burned from coast to coast in the first 2 weeks of May 1970. It wasn't just at Kent State. And it wasn't just an accident. There was a wave of desperation among the students who felt frustrated that after these years of peaceful protests and hoping and praying that the war would end in Vietnam, in fact, Nixon disregarded all that legitimate anti-war sentiment and was expanding the war into another country. No one got shot in downtown Kent that night. No one got shot the next night when the ROTC building was burned. And people were bayoneted the next evening on Sunday, May 3rd. But here on Monday, May 4th, many people try to bring up the events of downtown Kent or the ROTC fire and say, well, they burned a building. Well, they broke windows. That's why those students got shot. I mean, if somebody broke a window in downtown Kent, the way that you handle that problem in a democracy, and thank God we have a democracy here in America still, apprehend the criminal, let him have his day in court. If he's found guilty, put him in jail. That's how we deal with lawbreaking in America. I admit, our attorneys admit, rocks were thrown. There are photographs of students with their arms back and a rock in it and throwing it. There is testimony that Jeffrey Miller threw back a tear gas canister. Even Dean Kaler, the guy who was paralyzed, admitted in court he threw a couple of rocks at the guard. Dean Kaler, who had never been to a protest demonstration before that weekend in his life. He was 6'3" tall, he was going to be a basketball coach. He was a jock. Not a radical, not an extremist, but when his campus was taken over by the Guard, when students were stabbed by the bayonets, Dean Kaler even felt he had to be out there to take part in the protest. And in response to the attack, when the National Guard chased us with their guns, with their bayonets, they fired all this tear gas, they were chasing people around on May 4th in broad daylight, just as they had done the night before when they stabbed people with the bayonets. Even Dean Kaler, a conservative, religious guy, a very Christian young man, responded to this attack by picking up some rocks and throwing them at the Guard. But the distance was so great, if you look in the book there, when that standoff occurred, when I had that flag, the distance there, as measured off by the Justice Department in my presence in 1974 when they had the federal grand jury, 250 to 300 feet. That's how far. It's very hard for anybody in this room or even Roger Clemens to throw a rock, 250 or 300 feet. So the rocks fell short, and in that book there you'll see there's photographs of guardsmen throwing rocks at us. Sylvester Del Corso, the #1 general in the whole state of Ohio, the adjutant general of the whole National Guard in Ohio, was quoted by a Cleveland Plain Dealer reporter on Saturday, May 2nd, after they came in after the ROTC fire. The reporter saw him picking up rocks and throwing them at the students, and he says, well, if they can throw rocks at us, we can throw rocks at them. He said to his men, it's okay to throw rocks at the students. So many guardsmen did that during that weekend. The general even did. So the rock throwing throughout the weekend was both ways. Very cool. They get to the top of the hill. Out of the 72, only Troop G on the right flank. Stop, turn, begin to fire, continue to fire for 13 seconds. 67 bullets into a crowd of unarmed students. The closest student to the National Guard at that time was Joe Lewis, 60 feet away, raising his middle finger. The familiar gesture of disdain in America. Maybe sometimes here, if you get upset at somebody in the hallway or out at the parking lot, you might be, nobody has ever been shot here for doing that, fortunately. But Joe Lewis, because he raised that gesture as the National Guard was walking away, he let the National Guard know what he thought of them for stabbing his classmates the night before, for chasing him and for chasing everybody and shooting tear gas and denying us our rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and freedom to dissent. Joe Lewis told them what he thought. And for doing that, he was shot in the stomach with a .45 caliber pistol, and once he was on the ground, he was shot again in the ankle. They shot him twice. He was the closest student to the Guard. The National Guard got to the top of the hill. They were going into a very closed-in area. There were people standing on the veranda of Taylor Hall that were closer than 60 feet. For example, there was a professor there, Charles Brill, from the journalism school, which is housed inside of Taylor Hall. Charles Brill had the perfect view of the National Guard when they got to the top of the hill, when they stopped and began to fire. He said it looked like a firing squad. In that area where he was standing, where he had a perfect view and where other people heard and saw the verbal command to fire, and also Harry Jones take his baton and go like this, which is a hand signal for firing. There were many people up there that saw what happened. Joseph Lewis was trapped up in that area. When the guardsmen came to the top of the hill, quite a few of the students were pushed over into that area by Taylor Hall. If you look at the photographs, you can see that. A lot of people are standing as bystanders, even on that veranda of Taylor Hall. The film was enhanced with computers and so forth, and they determined that from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, in the line of fire, 18 students is all that were on the hill. 4 were shot. Joe Lewis, 90 feet away, was John Cleary, shot in the chest. Down at the bottom of the hill, 225 feet away, was myself and my roommate, Tom Grace, who was shot through the ankle. 18 students on the hill and about 140 in the parking lot. That's where they fired. They didn't shoot at the students closest to them. If they were really scared, if they thought their lives were in danger, they would have shot over there. But no, they shot in a very narrow range, and the vast majority of the bullets went into the parking lot. That's where all 4 students were killed. I mean, if these big, bad National Guardsmen were so afraid, as they claimed later, once the sniper theory was disproven by the National Guard's investigation, by the Highway Patrol investigation, by the FBI investigation, by the President's Commission on campus unrest, every investigation proved there's no snipers. So then the National Guard fell back on theory number 2, the self-defense theory. I think that there was a conspiracy, first of all, at Kent State, at least among the triggermen. How else can you explain the fact that out of 72 men, only a dozen stopped, turned, and fired, and continue to fire? I mean, it'd be different if they were afraid, or if they thought that they were being shot at by a sniper. You'd think that maybe 1 or 2 of them turn around and start to shoot, or maybe 3 or 4. But for a dozen to stop, turn, and all start to fire, and then to stand there and coolly just take shots into a distant parking lot. At least one guardsman emptied his whole clip. In the clip were 8 bullets. At least one guardsman emptied all 8 bullets. It's not an automatic, so you've got to consciously pull that trigger 8 times. For that to happen, obviously there had to be an order. So among those men, there was a conspiracy. It probably included their commanding officer or officers, and on the scene there was a lieutenant colonel, there was a general, there were a couple of captains, some lieutenants, some sergeants, all right behind the triggerman. So many people think that the conspiracy included the triggermen and their officers. Some people think that Governor Rhodes was involved because he came and gave this big speech, pounding his fist on the podium the day before the shooting, saying, "These students are the worst type of people we harbor in America."
I mean, didn't it once occur to any of these people that you getting into your riots and saying "off the pigs" and making threats against people, that all you were going to do was, when you do things like that to people, all they're going to do is respond to you in a more uptoned manner. If you make a threat to someone, they're going to come back and they're going to make a nastier threat to you. I mean, by making all these threats, you kind of brought it on yourself.
Well, I don't see how a rational person can think that someone throwing rocks in downtown Kent Friday night could have precipitated the shootings on May 4th. Or someone trying to burn down a building, and the building burned under very mysterious circumstances. We have proof that in Alabama, 5 days after our ROTC fire at Kent State, on May 7th, 1970, an FBI agent testified in 1975 to the federal investigation. It was the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I think your Senator Leahy here in Vermont was on that committee in 1975. An FBI agent at that time testified he helped burn an ROTC building on a campus in Alabama. And many people think that that's what happened at Kent State too, because we were there. We saw students try to burn the building. Then we left the area. As we're leaving, we saw the firemen putting the fire out. We saw the fire out. We left. We went down around the front campus area, out of sight of the commons and the building. We come back, and very mysteriously, the building's on fire. Many people think that there was a government agent or an FBI agent or what's called a provocateur. Go look at the definition of provocateur in the dictionary. You'll see that it's a very common phenomenon in tumultuous times where the government or an agent of the government or of a political organization will try to discredit the opposition by doing a violent act and trying to make the opposition look bad. Back in those days, it's very well documented that the Nixon administration had provocateurs on many campuses around the country. Prior to the 1960s, I think the overwhelming majority of the people always unquestioningly accepted what the government said or did. Since the war in Vietnam and since Watergate, and now I think since the Iran-Contra affair, you see a lot more skepticism and a lot more introspection among people to look within themselves and to look at the government and just ask healthy questions. And I think that even though these things were mistakes for our country, in a democracy, sometimes a mistake like this can cause some good to come out of it. And as a result now, I think we've had some tests of our democracy. Our democracy has survived these tests.
Should have been done long ago.